Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar about bullying. My name is Sarah Speltz, and I'm an Associate Director in the BU Alumni Relations Office. Today's webinar is sponsored by the BU Alumni Association and is offered as part of our Live to Learn Alumni Education Program. Many of our educational programs are held on campus, but we have begun to offer educational webinars because we want to connect with our alumni around the globe. And today we have alumni joining us from all over the country, with participants listening in more than 20 states in places like Florida, Kentucky, Missouri, Oklahoma, California, and of course, Massachusetts. Today we also want to extend a special welcome to the BU students and parents who have joined us online. Before I introduce today's speakers, some brief housekeeping notes. As you know by now, this webinar is being hosted on the Adobe Connect online meeting platform. If you experience any trouble with the audio or visual portions of this presentation, please contact Adobe Connect at 1-800-422-3623. Today's presentation is being recorded and will soon be available for on-demand viewing on the BU Alumni Association website, which is at bu.edu/alumni. Our speakers today are very eager to answer questions that you may have, and anytime throughout the presentation you are welcome to submit them through the Q&A chat box you see below the slides. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the day. Presenting today from the BU campus at the School of Education are Professors Melissa Holt and Jennifer Green. Melissa Holt is an assistant professor in counseling psychology. Prior to joining the School of Ed, Dr. Holt was a behavioral scientist in the Division of Violence Prevention at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Dr. Holt's research focuses on youth experiences with violence in the home, school, and community, with a particular emphasis on bullying. Dr. Holt completed her MS and PhD in counseling psychology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She holds a BS in psychology from Tufts. Jennifer Green is an associate professor in special education and a child clinical psychologist. Her research focuses on the role of schools in serving students with emotional and behavioral disorders. Dr. Green also studies school bullying. She specializes in assessing bullying and determining how assessments can be used to inform school safety planning. Dr. Green completed her doctorate at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And prior to joining BU, she trained at Yale School of Medicine and in the Department of Healthcare Policy at Harvard Medical School. Melissa and Jennifer, thank you for joining us today. If you give me a few seconds to change the slides, I will turn things over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah. Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, which we call Beyond Bullying Basics, Understanding Complexities of Bullying and How It Impacts Children. I'm Jennifer Green in the Special Education Program, and Sarah mentioned I'm here today with Melissa Holt, who's a professor in counseling psychology. And Melissa and I have each spent more than 15 years studying bullying and bullying prevention in schools. Let me go back to that first slide. Okay. When we were talking about the topic for today's webinar, we talked about some of the common messages that we hear in the media and the mainstream about bullying. Mainly we hear that bullying is very bad and that schools should be doing more to stop bullying. And both of those are absolutely true, but we wanted to take some time today to talk about just how complex bullying can be and some of the challenges to addressing bullying effectively. As Sarah mentioned, the webinar is scheduled to be an hour, but our plan is to speak for about 45 minutes and then respond to questions. So we do hope that you'll submit questions as we go along. Melissa and I co-lead a research lab in the School of Education. What we have up right now is a screenshot of our lab webpage. It's the Social Adjustment and Bullying Prevention Lab. Our website is up on the screen. It's www.bu.edu/bullying. And we hope that you'll visit our website to learn more about our work and the team of undergraduate and graduate students who are involved in our research and outreach activities to schools. So in the webinar today, we're going to begin by defining bullying and talking about how challenging it can be to define bullying. We'll next talk about the prevalence and outcomes of bullying. We'll then provide a brief overview of bullying-related legislation in the U.S. We will discuss existing bullying prevention efforts with a focus on what is working. Next, we'll talk about partnerships that our lab has formed with local schools. And finally, we'll provide recommendations for caregivers who may be concerned that their child or perhaps your child is involved in bullying. So we thought we'd start by telling 3 different stories that we think raise questions about how complicated it can be to determine whether behavior is bullying. The first story is about a local school where kindergartners frequently swing on the tire swing during recess. So that's the tire swing picture. And in this school, there were 4 friends in one of the kindergarten classes who would go out to swing on the tire swing every day and take turns pushing the swing. It soon became clear that one of the 4 friends couldn't push the swing as high as the other 3. The other 3 friends told the one who pushed too softly that she wasn't allowed to push anymore and could only ride on the swing. She said that that was unfair, but no matter how much she protested and complained, her classmates refused to let her push the swing. And this happened every day for 2 weeks. So in a minute, we'll talk about whether that's bullying. The second story is about a boy in the 6th grade who is walking down the hall at school. A larger 7th grade boy came up from behind him, called out a racial slur, and pushed the boy into a locker. The 2 boys don't have any classes together or any other relationships, and the 6th grader who had been pushed ended up with a bloody nose and a cut on his forehead. The third story is about a group of 9th grade girls who went out to the mall together after school. While at the mall, they saw a classmate, and this was a classmate who they would often make fun of in school, and their classmate was trying on clothes at one of the stores. Unbeknownst to their classmate, they took an unflattering picture of her in the changing room. They posted that picture to an Instagram account, and it was seen by over 100 students at their high school. All 3 of these situations describe behaviors that we certainly want to stop, but not all of them would be considered bullying. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what bullying is and is not. Bullying is a subset of peer aggression, so we can think about a broader category of aggression between peers or classmates, but bullying has 3 specific characteristics. The first characteristic that defines bullying is that it's intentional. This means that actions were done on purpose and with the intent to harm another person. In the first story I told, it's not clear whether the intention of the kindergartners was to harm their friend, even though it certainly seemed to have that impact. It's likely that their initial focus was on negotiating the use of the swing. In the second and the third stories that I told, there was a clear intention to cause harm to somebody else. The second defining characteristic of bullying is that it's repeated. This means that the aggressive behavior occurred multiple times and in the context of a relationship between the target and the aggressor or aggressors. In the first story, the exclusion from pushing the swing occurred for 2 weeks, so it was certainly repeated. In the third story, the girl who was targeted in the changing room was frequently made fun of by her peers, even before the Instagram event. However, in the second story, the boys had no relationship with one another, and that act, even though it's the most physically aggressive, was not repeated. So in that case, we might describe that as an example of physical assault, but not specifically bullying. The third defining characteristic of bullying is that it involves an imbalance of power between the target and the aggressor, such that the target cannot defend themselves or make the bullying stop. The idea here is that bullying is not just when people are friends one day and then not friends the next day and then friends again, but that there is a clear power imbalance that makes it difficult for someone to defend themselves. Power imbalance is least clear in the first story, where the kindergartners are described as friends. In this case, I would want to know what the relationship was like between the students in their classroom and during activities other than their use of the tire swing. In the second example, the aggressor was older and bigger, so there was clearly a power imbalance. And the third story involved a group of students ganging up against a peer. So in these 2 cases, there's a clear power imbalance too. Based on this definition, it is only clear that the third story described bullying. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the slide to change up here.
It's no problem. We just lost your audio for 1 second. No rush.
Can you hear me now?
I can. Yep. And if you just want to turn the microphone down just a little bit, I think will be perfect.
Okay. We tried to do that. I'm not sure if that worked.
No problem. It's fine. You can leave it right where it is. Just unmute and keep going.
Okay, we're not on mute, so I'm going to keep going if you can hear
Yep,
me.
go for it. Great.
Okay. And could you change the slide? Okay. The original definition of bullying as involving intentional and repeated aggression in the context of an imbalance of power was developed by Donald Vayas in the mid 1970s, and it's the same definition that continues to be used by researchers and legislators today. So if you look at bullying legislation in most of our states, you'll see that most bullying legislation will define bullying as requiring intentional behavior that's repeated and has a power imbalance. The Centers for Disease Control recently reviewed and reconfirmed this definition. Bullying can take place in a number of forms, most of which fall into two categories: direct or indirect aggression. Direct aggression is aggression that's enacted between the target and the aggressor, and it can be physical, verbal, involving threats or sexual jokes and gestures. In contrast, indirect aggression is enacted through a third party. So common forms of indirect aggression are rumors, gossip, and social exclusion. In these cases, the aggressor is not interacting directly with the target, but instead interacting with another peer, for example, to spread rumors, and it's that interaction that impacts the target, even though the aggressor and the target might have no direct interaction with one another. Bullying can also involve property theft or damage and be aggression that occurs online or through the internet. And in that case, it can be either direct or it can be indirect. There are several reasons that bullying is complex to address, and here we describe some of them. First, bullying is highly associated with other forms of violence and victimization. As Melissa is going to talk more about shortly, many students who are involved in bullying are also involved in other victimization and violence experiences, such as community violence or child maltreatment, either as an aggressor, a target, or a bystander. And that can make responding to bullying more complex. Second, bullying is a relationship and therefore involves social dynamics. Just as relationships between adults are complex, so too are relationships among children. In order to effectively prevent bullying, we're going to suggest that it's important for adults to recognize that bullying typically serves a function for aggressors. So aggressors are bullying for a reason, and it's important for interventions to recognize that reason and to intervene in that function that it's serving. Children who are targeted will also sometimes enter into relationships in which they're vulnerable, and it's important to understand that relational pattern that some children develop. It's also very hard for adults, much less children, to stand up to bystanders when people are aggressive. And that's important for us as adults to recognize when we're helping children to respond and to stand up as a bystander in that witnessing role. Finally, bullying relationships, just like adult relationships, are fluid and are not static. So what is a problem between children one year may not be the next year, and vice versa. Third, bullying is just one piece of a child's broader social emotional profile. Many students involved in bullying are still learning about power and control in social relationships. They're still learning how to manage and regulate their own emotions, and they might also be experiencing anger, depression, impulse control challenges, and anxiety that can interact with their role in the bullying dynamic, and that's something that's important for us to recognize when we're intervening in bullying. Finally, there are significant individual differences in bullying experiences for youth. Although we're using one word here, which is bullying, the behaviors and experiences we're describing can range tremendously. They can be verbal or physical, mild or extreme. They can be related to size and age, or related to race, gender, sexual orientation, country of origin. And they can be dyadic, or sometimes involving entire classrooms full of students. And one of the reasons we decided to tell those three stories at the beginning was to give an example of just how wide-ranging bullying can be. A number of studies have been conducted to estimate the prevalence or rates of bullying in the US and internationally. In the US, studies generally find that about 1/3 of youth across all ages report being involved in bullying, either as an aggressor, a target, or as both an aggressor and a target. And this group is a group we call bully victims, and they're often the most at-risk group. The students who are involved both in bullying some children and are also being bullied by others. But even if students are not involved in bullying directly as targets or aggressors, most students will witness bullying. Studies indicate that bystanders are present in 80% of bullying incidents, so most children will observe it happening around them. In addition, bullying tends to peak in early adolescence and to drop in high school. So middle school is an area where we're most concerned about bullying. I'm going to turn over the microphone now to Melissa, who's going to talk about disparities in bullying.
Thank you, Jen. So now that Jen has provided some background information about bullying and national statistics, I'd like to turn to disparities in bullying rates, and then we'll address whether rates have been increasing or decreasing. So first, in terms of sex differences in bullying rates, one meta-analysis, which is essentially a study that takes into account findings from multiple studies on the same topic, looked at gender differences for victims, bullies, and bully victims, those three groups that Jen just mentioned. Results indicated that males are more likely than females to be in all three of these groups, although the effect was weak for victims and small for bullies and bully victims, suggesting that there are not dramatic gender differences. With respect to specific forms of bullying, research indicates that boys are more involved in physical and verbal bullying than girls are. In contrast, until late childhood and early adolescence, rates of relational aggression are similar for boys and girls. Then, girls become more involved in relational aggression than boys. Minority youth and students with disabilities experience more bullying victimization than their peers. For example, a study of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth found that approximately 85% of those surveyed reported being verbally harassed. Further, students with disabilities are up to twice as likely to be involved in bullying as a victim or perpetrator than students without disabilities. Rates might be higher when particular disabilities are considered. For example, students with specific learning disabilities are 3.5 times more likely to experience bullying victimization than their peers. Notably, research suggests students in self-contained classrooms are more likely to engage in perpetration and to be victimized than youth placed in inclusive classroom settings. For individuals working in school settings, having a sense of where disparities may exist is helpful in that it can help staff identify which students might be at increased risk for bullying involvement. So next, people often ask us, is bullying becoming more common? Most research suggests, in fact, that bullying rates are declining. For example, the World Health Organization conducted a survey, the findings of which were published in 2012, that showed declines in peer victimization in most countries included in the survey. Notably, however, declines were generally small, often around under 10%. With respect to changes in rates in the United States specifically, the National Center for Education Statistics has conducted surveys on bullying among 12 to 18-year-olds since 2005. And in 2013, 22% of those surveyed reported bullying victimization. This is in contrast to the 28 to 32% of students reporting bullying victimization in the other 4 years this information was collected from students, suggesting declines in bullying victimization among adolescents. Further, another study focused on physical bullying specifically found that it declined from 22% in 2003 to 15% in 2008. However, there is some research suggesting that online harassment in particular may be increasing. So specifically, in a study by Finkelhor and colleagues, they found rates of 6% in 2000 compared to 11% in 2010. So next, I'd like to turn to one model that is used to better understand bullying and its risk and protective factors, the social ecological model, which you see here depicted on the slide. In brief, this model suggests that a student's likelihood of being involved in bullying is influenced by a range of factors that exist at multiple levels. As you can see from the figure here, this includes individual characteristics and factors at the family, classroom, school, and community levels. Beyond this, we can think of societal factors that might come into play as well, such as bullying legislation in a particular state. We'll return to legislation a bit later in this presentation, but for now I'd like to review some of the key risk and protective factors for bullying involvement that have been identified to date, and these will be at each levels of the social ecology shown here. So on this slide, we can think of risk factors for both perpetration and victimization. I also want to highlight here, before we go into those factors, that the presence of one of these factors does not mean that perpetration or victimization will automatically occur. Rather, these are factors that have been shown to increase the likelihood of involvement. So first, let's take a look at the perpetration risk factors. So here we know that factors associated with bullying perpetration include difficulties in problem solving and a tendency to externalize behaviors. Along similar lines, when confronted with hypothetical scenarios, bullies are more likely to indicate that they would use destructive strategies, including reacting aggressively than their peers. Additional factors associated with bullying perpetration include high emotionality and poor impulse control. As noted on this slide, the link to cognitive empathy is less clear. Some studies have found that perpetration is associated with lower levels of empathy, particularly for girls, but other studies have not found a relation. Perpetration has, however, been found to be associated with moral disengagement, meaning that students who bully others are more likely to justify their use of bullying behaviors than their peers. We also know that peer groups matter. A student in a peer group that engages in bullying perpetration will also tend to perpetrate bullying behaviors themselves. And in fact, peer group bullying perpetration levels are one of the strongest risk factors for one's own bullying perpetration. In terms of family influence, characteristics such as low cohesion and parents who condone violence relate to perpetration. When we consider which classroom factors might promote bullying perpetration, classroom norms are important, given that aggression is higher in classrooms that don't support targets of bullying, as well as in classrooms with hierarchical structures. Finally, there is some emerging evidence that living in a violent community increases risk for bullying perpetration. Turning to the right side of this table, in terms of factors associated with victimization, in addition to individual factors noted before, we know that obesity increases risk for victimization. In addition, when a student is perceived as vulnerable, submissive, or passive, they are more likely to be targeted. Similarly, anxiety and difficulties regulating emotional reactions are associated with peer victimization. Not surprisingly, victims of bullying often have difficulties in social problem solving, potentially due to lower self-esteem and low self-efficacy. In terms of the role of the family, maternal depression has been found to be related to bullying victimization, and some research suggests that overprotective parenting is as well. For some students, the victim role is reinforced in the family. For example, one study found that victims of bullying at school were more likely to be teased by their families about their appearance than students who were not victims of bullying. Finally, with respect to the school context, victims are more likely to report the lowest levels of teacher support and lower levels of school belonging than their peers. On the other side, we know that there are a number of protective factors that exist at multiple levels of the social ecology. So, youth with high-quality friendships are less likely to perpetrate bullying, as are those with parents who know about their activities and are responsive. School protective factors include having positive adult role models and a positive classroom and school climate. Factors protecting students against victimization have also been identified. One of the strongest factors is social support, although this association is nuanced. We know that having friends, high-quality friendships, and being liked by peers can protect against victimization. In addition, having moderate to high levels of perceived social support is associated with a lower likelihood of being bullied. However, social support might not be protective when a victim's friends are also being victimized. Another protective factor identified in the literature is problem-solving coping skills. And in the family context, maternal and sibling warmth, as well as high parental involvement and support, are protective. Finally, victims of bullying are most likely to seek help to stop bullying in cases in which they believe the school will be responsive and that the bullying will stop. As such, creating supportive, responsive school environments is one factor critically important to stopping bullying victimization and helping students. So next, I'd like to turn to what we know about ways in which bullying involvement might affect functioning. As you can see here, we'll talk about two key areas and then some other domains. So in terms of psychological functioning, we know that youth involved in bullying are more likely to report symptoms of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation and behaviors. Importantly,
As most of you know, suicide is often in the news and being linked to bullying. And I want to note that it's not more common just among victims of bullying, but also among bullies and bully victims, although a causal link has not been necessarily established. Research also shows that bullying involvement diminishes sense of school belonging for students. Mixed evidence exists for the association between bullying and grades. For perpetration, there is strong evidence that it's associated with academic functioning. However, for bullying victimization, this is a bit less clear. Some studies have found that it's associated with academic functioning and others have not. And the last bullet point here just talks about other domains that have been examined. So for example, we know that bullying involvement is related to sexual risk-taking, somatic complaints, substance use, other victimization exposures, and for perpetrators of bullying in particular, later aggression. So given that now we've talked about the number of youth affected by bullying and its relations to functioning in multiple areas, this has been addressed by states, all of which now have legislation in place to address bullying. There are significant differences across states, however, in terms of what legislation includes. So for example, only about half of the states encourage bullying prevention, and only 1/3 mandate that bullying prevention programs are put into place. Further, most legislation doesn't provide specific information about what programs to consider or features to look for in a program. Interestingly, however, we do know that the type of legislation is in fact related to bullying rates in the state. Specifically, in states that include at least one of the legislative components recommended by the Department of Education, such as specification of prohibited conduct, rates of bullying and cyberbullying are lower. So, what are schools doing in response? Schools, adults, and even legislators are coming together to think about what they can do to design prevention and intervention programs that reduce bullying and its associated negative effects. However, something we're also asked frequently is, are these programs actually effective? So I'm going to put up a number of meta-analyses, and these again are essentially studies that combine all studies to date on a given topic. So one of these meta-analyses by Maryland colleagues found that bullying prevention programs don't really reduce bullying behaviors. However, they did address some other outcomes, like decreases in attitudes supporting bullying. A more recent meta-analysis by Toffee and Farrington, though, did find reductions of 20 to 30% for perpetration and 17 to 20% for victimization. And they note here that the Alveus program, which is one that was designed and primarily implemented in Norway, and those with particular elements, such as those that included teacher training, were most effective. And I also wanted to note that there's that research supports use of programs aimed at bystanders, and notes that those are generally effective, particularly those at the high school level. So here I wanted to provide some information about research that shows what key components in effective bullying prevention programs are. So I'm going to just put them up here. So we know that most effective interventions are multi-level, and given that the risk and protective factors I noted earlier show that, it makes sense that you'd want to address all these levels in terms of prevention, individual, classroom, and school levels. And families should also be involved, and at times schools might even bring in the broader community. Given the importance of including the entire student body and school body in a comprehensive approach, we know that things like one-time assemblies and policies such as zero tolerance do not work. And here you can see the list of the types of elements that generally are known to be effective, such as involving multiple constituencies, bystander intervention, and increasing monitoring. So despite that we know this, why is it that programs aren't working better or better than we might expect them to? There are a number of possibilities, including those we provide here on this slide. Although bullying is influenced by multiple levels of the social ecology, this is not often the approach taken, and interventions are not designed at all levels, and sometimes pieces are missing. So for example, school climate is critical, yet improvements to school climate are often not a central part of prevention efforts. In addition, programs are not always implemented with fidelity, meaning that for various reasons, parts of programs are not implemented, or they're not implemented as designed, which results in them being less effective. Further, as I noted previously, and Jen did as well, bullying overlaps with other forms of victimization and aggression, yet this overlap is often not addressed. For secondary students in particular, there are a unique set of issues to consider. For example,
At older ages, bullying manifests itself differently, and as such might be harder to address. Teachers are more likely to notice and intervene with physical bullying, but it occurs more often at the elementary school level, whereas less visible forms of bullying occur as students become older. In addition, motivations for bullying might vary in adolescence, with an increased interest in gaining social status, which is more salient among this population than among younger students. Despite these challenges that we've noted, there are some programs that are effective at addressing bullying, and we wanted to be able to at least provide some information here about them. So, I went ahead a slide. When schools ask us which programs are effective, we typically direct them to one of the online registries that provides information about evidence-based programs on a range of topics. So one such registry is listed here, the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs, and that includes bullying prevention programs. We wanted to also give you an example of one effective program, in this case, Second Step. So this is a lesson plan-based suite of programs developed by the Committee for Children that has developmentally appropriate materials for elementary and middle school students. Materials focus on social emotional development broadly, as well as on bullying prevention specifically. So in this slide, we provide a general framework for Second Step. In the left box, you see some of the key intervention components, such as developing a school-wide bullying policy and teaching friendship, social, and emotional regulation skills. Second Step aims to improve both proximal, meaning shorter term, and distal, meaning longer term outcomes. For example, for proximal outcomes, individuals might demonstrate improved social competence, peers might engage in more positive bystander behaviors, and the school norms might become less supportive of bullying behaviors. In the longer term, through changing these proximal outcomes, additional changes will occur, as indicated in the distal outcomes box. This is where reductions in bullying perpetration and victimization, for example, would be seen. Schools implementing Second Step have access to fully developed lesson plans that include materials such as teacher guides, videos to show, homework assignments for students, and posters. We wanted to give you just a small sense of what that could look like. So as an example, let's take a look of one of the lessons and one part of one of the lessons for grade 3. So this photo comes from a Unit 2 lesson which focuses on understanding our differences. As part of this lesson, teachers show this photo and then provide the following prompt. They say, look at this photo and think about ways that Olivia and Yasaman appear different. Yasaman comes from Iran. She wears different clothing from Olivia. English is not her first language. Sometimes Olivia laughs when other students tease Yasaman for being different. After this prompt, students are guided through a number of follow-up questions, some of which are shown here. And also you see a teacher response that would be used after one of the questions as well. Additional components of this lesson include playing an empathy song, having students play a game, discussing ways students can use empathy and understand one another's differences, and asking students to complete a weekly skill check. To give you a sense of how materials are adopted to developmental stage, here you see part of a sample homework assignment for 7th grade students. This is from a lesson that focuses on emotion management, coping with stress. So here you could take a look, but essentially you're thinking about a stressful situation, identifying it, and then the homework goes on to have you think about ways you might cope with that situation. And finally, given, as I noted, that Second Step addresses bystanders, which we know is important to do for all ages, and particularly for bystanders, here's a poster that's used for 8th grade students that's part of the Bullying Prevention, Labels, Types, and Stereotypes lessons. This poster corresponds with pieces of a lesson plan. For example, watching a video of a student talking about their experiences being a bystander in an incident related to another student's ethnicity. In this case, the student did not intervene. And on the video, the student notes regretting this decision. So in class, the students then discuss how they might approach situations like the one described in the video. Although what we've shown just provides a very brief snapshot of Second Step, the website for Second Step does provide more detailed information. And as I noted, this program has research support for its use in elementary and middle schools. Specifically, studies have found improvements in social competence, aggression, particularly physical aggression, and prosocial behaviors. Notably, studies have also documented that fidelity to Second Step is important. One study, for example, found that the number of lessons completed was associated with student outcomes. I'm now going to turn it back to Jen, who will discuss ways in which our research team has partnered with schools to address and to assess bullying.
In the past 6 years, we've built our lab at BU to serve as a resource to schools and also to contribute to the research literature. One way that we've done this is by partnering with schools to assess students' bullying experiences and mental health, and then we provide that data back to schools and help them to figure out how they can use that data to determine meaningful and actionable steps to respond to bullying in their particular context. We are constantly and continually seeking active partnerships with schools, so if you're in a school and this is something that you're interested in, please reach out to us. In particular, our focus has been on conducting anonymous surveys, which can provide school-level data to inform intervention planning, but anonymous surveys obviously cannot identify individual students involved in bullying. If we were to collect identifiable data, that has a number of advantages. Mainly, it provides an opportunity to support the students most in need. However, it also has the disadvantages of reducing the number of students who will participate in the survey, and it raises questions about the accuracy of information and how comfortable students feel expressing their needs. So as an example, we recently collected a bullying survey in a school that involved collecting data from students, staff, and parents. We assessed bullying, mental health, help seeking, and related experiences among students. And then our research team came together and we analyzed the data, and we met with stakeholders at the school to present the results and to identify next steps for the school to respond to bullying. We also have recently been involved in evaluating bullying prevention programs. So we've gone into schools that are involved in bullying prevention efforts and helped them to figure out whether those efforts are working and for which students they're working best. On this slide, I have examples of some of the questions that we address in our assessments, and we tailor the questions we ask to address the needs and the questions that are raised by our individual partnerships with schools. So these are just examples of some of the questions that we've been able to answer in the past. How much of a problem is bullying in this particular school? What types of bullying are students experiencing? Who is involved? Where does bullying occur? What are the reasons that students are bullied? Who do students talk to about bullying? How do peers and teachers respond to bullying? And what is the impact of bullying on students? And in this next slide, we show some examples of the types of information we provide back to schools. I just copied some portions of our report here. In this particular school that this report came from, ignoring and we also had questions about exclusion were the most common types of bullying reported by students. And ignoring was reported significantly more often by females than by males, which is a common trend that we see in the literature. Second, in that table on the right, students in this particular school reported that bullying most often occurred in classrooms, followed by the playground or sports field. Often when we go into schools, teachers and other school staff are surprised when they learn that students perceive bullying is occurring during class time. But this type of information can lead to really productive conversations about what bullying can look like in classrooms and how teachers can respond on the spot when they see bullying occur. In addition, it's common that the playground and lunchroom are near the top of the list of where bullying is likely to occur. These are some of the most unstructured and unmonitored times for students during the school day. As a final example of data we provide in that bottom piece, students in the school were asked if they have missed school to avoid being picked on or bullied. And among all students who completed our survey, 15% said that they sometimes miss school for this reason. So that means in a middle school with 200 students, 15% would amount to 30 students having missed school during the school year specifically because of bullying behaviors. However, among those who reported being bullied, almost 28% reported missing school because of bullying. Go ahead. So on these next few slides, we're going to talk about what caregivers could do. And this first slide focuses on general tips for caregivers or parents if you're thinking about bullying for your child. And then we have two following slides where we'll discuss recommendations for what to do and what not to do if you specifically think that your child's being bullied. So first, for all children, it's important for caregivers to maintain open communication about social experiences at school, which may involve bullying. So this means asking children about who they're playing with, what kinds of interactions they're seeing, whether they're observing bullying, whether their teachers are talking about bullying on an ongoing basis. Second, caregivers can watch for warning signs that might indicate that students are involved in bullying. So important warning signs are if children suddenly want to avoid school, friends, or other social situations, if children come home with unexplained injuries or lost or destroyed items, For some children, warning signs can be difficulty sleeping or other physical symptoms like stomach aches or feeling sick. And because not all children will directly report bullying, even when they have very good relationships with adults, watching for warning signs can be a really important way to introduce conversations about what's going on and why children are struggling. Third, all caregivers can coach children on how to respond to bullying if they're targeted or if they observe it among their peers. And as we mentioned previously, most children will at least observe bullying. So if your child observes bullying or it feels like they're a target of bullying, you can encourage them to talk to a trusted adult at school. And one step in doing that is helping them to figure out which adult they would go to and how they might approach that adult, or even role playing with them, how they could start that conversation. You can also model strategies to stop bullying, such as saying stop in a clear and direct voice, or encouraging your child to walk away and to find a friend who they can talk to. Fourth, in general, parents can model or caregivers can model kindness and leadership. You can encourage children to help others who are being bullied so that they can get help, or provide them with support if they think that a friend or another child's being targeted. And then we as parents and caregivers can pay attention to what we say about others, and when our children might overhear us building other people up or putting them down, and the messages that that sends to them about how we interact with other people in our lives. Fifth, it's important for all caregivers to promote children's strengths. So for all children, we want to find places where they feel successful and where they feel like they have peers and adults who they can connect with, because we know that these are some of the most important protective factors. And the resource we provide here is a link to stopbullying.gov. It's a government website that provided the tips listed above and goes into much more depth about how parents can respond to bullying. So the next slide, we're going to go a little bit further to talk here about recommendations for parents or caregivers if you think your child is being bullied. First, take your child's concerns seriously. Bullying should not be a normal part of growing up and often does not stop or go away on its own. In fact, because of the imbalance of power between aggressors and targets that we talked about earlier, targets often experience helplessness if they try to stop bullying, and they're often unsuccessful at stopping it without help. Second, become familiar with your school's bullying prevention and intervention plan. All states have bullying legislation, and most of them require schools to have a bullying prevention or intervention plan that's documented. And these plans are in place to make sure that there's a comprehensive and a systematic response to bullying. Third, contact the school about your concerns and make sure to document your concerns in writing. If there are several instances of aggression, make sure you keep track of when they occurred and who was involved. You can share that information again in writing with school administrators so that you can document repetition or a pattern of aggression. Fourth, once a plan is in place for responding, continue to check in with your child to identify whether the plan is working. Sometimes plans will work well at first, and then bullying behaviors will reemerge over time. So you want to keep checking in and seeing how your child is doing. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, as we mentioned before, you as a parent or caregiver have an important opportunity to build your child's strengths and friendships in other settings. Give your child opportunities to do things that they love and with people who they connect with. These relationships, even when they're not at school, are very important protective factors and can help children feel successful in social relationships. The next slide includes some recommendations for things not to do. First, don't dismiss your child's concerns. It can sometimes be tempting as a parent to want everything to be okay with our children, but this is an important time to listen to children's concerns and to make sure they can note that they can come to us when they need to without feeling dismissed or embarrassed about what they're saying. Second, we recommend against telling your child to fight back. It's not at all clear that this works to stop bullying, and it is very clear that fighting back has other negative consequences for children. Third, it rarely helps to contact the other caregivers or interact with the other child directly. That if you think there's an aggressor's caregivers, your school staff should be the one to reach out to other caregivers, because these can be very tricky conversations to have. There are many ways that we've seen conversations between parents go poorly, even when parents are friends, and it often makes the situation at school worse for children, not better. Finally, caregivers often want to know what school staff are doing to address potential aggressors in bullying situations. And sometimes school staff will give this information, but as we mentioned earlier, bullying behaviors are often part of larger social emotional concerns or functioning of students. And in some cases, actually many cases, it's not appropriate for school staff to share with families the interventions that they're putting into place for another child at school. On this final slide, before we take questions, are some links to resources that you might find helpful. So again, we have the Stop Bullying website, which is the government website that outlines a lot of the tips that we're describing here. There's a website for the National Bullying Prevention Center, which is through the PACER organization, and this specifically has information on bullying among students with disabilities. And then we have a link here to the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, which is the NRAP data set that Melissa mentioned earlier that lists evidence-based programs, including bullying prevention programs. And we're going to stop there. We have both of our email addresses posted here as well as our lab website address. And again, we'll take questions now, but hope that you'll reach out to us and check out our lab website, and look forward to being in touch with some of you in the future.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Melissa. That was great. All of you who are listening, if you'd like to pose a question to our presenters, you can type it in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen. And I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger, which is for my purposes so that I can read all of the questions. So go ahead and submit those anytime. We do have a couple of questions that were submitted during the presentation. Jamie would like to know, can you tell us if the studies on increased risk look at students in public schools versus private schools? Is there a difference?
Jamie, thanks for that question. I would say for the most part, studies have focused on public schools. There might be some exceptions there, but as far as we know, there wouldn't be a difference in terms of risk in terms of the existing research on risk and protective factors for both perpetration and victimization.
Thank you.
Are there additional questions?
Okay, it sounds like there's just some sound issues for a minute, so we will hold until we hear the additional questions. I see some hands are being raised, which I assume that means you are all asking questions, which we appreciate. Oh, right, that's a good point. So Jen, this is Melissa, and Jen was just to Jamie's last question about public versus private. One thing that is the case is that the legislation is applying to public schools rather than private schools. And we're getting the question typed into us, so we'll just wait till that's typed up, and then we'll go ahead and answer that next question. So the question involves, as says, as a therapist, children often report that when they tell an adult about bullying and the bully is confronted, the bullying gets worse. And so they want to know how to best respond.
This is a difficult question to answer generally because it depends on a number of things, including the age of the student, the type of bullying that's occurring, and the relationship between the target and the aggressor. So it's likely to depend on the particular situation. One thing that I would recommend is talking with the person who's reporting the bullying about what they see happening and brainstorming with them solutions and giving them a list of solutions that you have available in the school. And we could talk more about what some of those solutions are, but asking them how they think that the school could support them in being bullied and providing with them a list of ways that the school can already support them in being bullied. And that's a more appropriate answer for older students than for younger students. And obviously the top priority is to protect students but also want to make sure that they feel engaged in the process and like the response is going to be helpful and meaningful to them.
Okay, and the next question we have coming through is, how do you address a child who may be bullying, who does not see themselves as a bully? And that's a great question. So I think in part from a broader perspective, if we think about prevention programming, that's increasing awareness around some of these issues in terms of having children understand their effects on one another, in terms of what it might be like from a target's perspective of experiencing verbal or physical aggression. So I think in terms of the individual level, again, it's complicated, I think, like Jen alluded to in the last question, in terms of the particulars of the situation, but really talking through with the child, just trying to help them understand the other person's perspective on how those behaviors might influence another child. We have another question coming in here as well. I'm going to just turn this over to Jen. This is now for the next one.
The next question is, when do schools need to report instances of bullying to social services? That's a great question. I'm not actually sure that I know the answer to that. The legislation is state by state. There's no federal legislation for bullying prevention. It's all state legislated, as are social services regulations around reporting. So I would think that would vary by state. I don't know, Melissa, if you have another answer.
So this is Melissa. I agree with what Jen said there, and I think that again, it's probably a little bit complicated in terms of the particular incident. And trying to better understand which social services the person asking the question would be referring to. But yeah, I think it would be state specific.
Hi, can you hear me again?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great, thank you. I'm not sure what happened, but I'm back. So let's continue with a few more questions. For parents, it is often difficult to distinguish between bullying and what I will call normal elementary school / high school angst and teasing. What are your recommendations on how to distinguish?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think it is complicated, and I think that's part of what this is Melissa that Jen was talking about at the beginning. I think really going back and thinking about those core elements that Jen discussed can help distinguish it. You know, is it repeated? Is it intentional? Is there the power imbalance? So thinking about those pieces coming into play. And then I would also say, and Jen mentioned this before, sort of it gets murky because sometimes it matters less about whether it's classified as bullying or not versus the effect it's having on the individual. So I think that's important to consider as well.
All right, we have many questions here. Jennifer is hoping you could talk a little bit more about exclusion, specifically with girls and its relationship to bullying.
This is Jen. Exclusion is considered one of the bullying behaviors that is classified as bullying. So when students continually exclude someone else, again with the intention of causing them harm. So that's to distinguish exclusion for the purpose of causing harm from exclusion for the purpose of connecting with other friends. So if I am having a birthday party and I invite only a few close friends, then that's not exclusion of everybody else because my goal is to invite my close friends. It's not to actively exclude someone else per se. So one of the things we think about is where exclusion is becoming intentional to make someone feel left out, or it ends up making them feel left out. And that's the kind of exclusion that we're more concerned about, is exclusion that happens repeatedly and has the effect of someone feeling hurt.
Diane has a question about adult role models. Knowing that positive adult role models are so crucial to healthy youth environments, are there any studies or programs that highlight programs that address bullying behaviors among adults? And is there any evidence that these type of programs have an impact or can change behaviors?
Yeah, great question. In terms of that second piece around other programs from what I understand, supporting adults and developing related to bullying or good role models. I don't know about any of those, but we certainly do know, as I think it was Diane you said, asked that that having those positive role models that are not engaging in behaviors that are aggressive in any way is really important in terms of setting that family context or that school context to really show children that those behaviors are not appropriate.
German wants to know, does the number of students in a school have a direct incidence in the bullying rate?
Good question, Jeremy. So no, that doesn't, as far as we could know, there is no research supporting that the size of the school would influence the rate of bullying.
Mariko asks, do you think restorative justice system works well to solve bullying?
Yeah, good question. And I know a number of schools do have implemented restorative justice. I can't say in terms of specific studies looking at restorative justice as a bullying prevention effort that I'm aware of any that have looked at that as an outcome. We could be missing one, but.
Eric would like to know, what outcomes should a parent expect from a school when they notify administrators about a bullying situation?
It depends somewhat on the legislation, but here in Massachusetts, if they notify the school should conduct an investigation into bullying, and they should follow up with all involved students, which would be the student who's targeted, the student who is the presumed aggressor, and any bystanders. And they should be looking at what behaviors have occurred, how long they've been going on, what the impact is on students, and then if they have a finding that there's bullying, they should put into place a bullying plan, a bullying intervention plan to support all of the involved students. And we generally recommend against zero tolerance disciplinary policies related to bullying, and tend to think of it more as an opportunity to teach social problem solving and students how to improve their social relationships. So there's not evidence that suspending students, for example, is effective at stopping them from bullying, and there's some evidence to suggest that suspending makes it more likely that students will be involved in aggressive behaviors over time. So what we're more interested in is seeing schools supporting students and helping them to develop better social problem solving skills.
We have time for a couple more. We'll try to get through these. Paul asks, does involving the court system by schools make matters worse or improve the situation?
Interesting question, Paul. I don't think that we have an answer for that in terms of how that might affect outcomes.
Reggie asks, is there some increased work on bullying during after school or summer programs that we can refer to?
Another really good question. These are good areas for research. Not that we can think of directly, but great question. And actually, particularly if we think about after school programs, those tend to be less structured, potentially have less supervision. So those could be certainly areas in which bullying is would there be fewer opportunities for intervention on the part of staff?
And this is a little bit longer question. This might be the last one that we have time for today. Joanna has a comment and question. A lot of bullying policies have it written in that there is no tolerance for retaliation, but students realistically, especially at the middle school level, do not report bullying for fear of social repercussions because the perpetrator will figure out they have reported. Is there research on preventing this or strategies to maintain anonymity?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're not aware of any research on that. There are a lot of schools that have anonymous reporting procedures for just that reason, where students can describe, often online or with the drop box in the school, the bullying that they've observed or that they're concerned about, and then the school can respond to anonymous reports of bullying. We also have worked with schools that have had open conversations with students about it. So when we conduct the kinds of assessments we were talking about earlier, schools will often bring that data back to their student body, and that can lead to conversations among students about how they would like to report bullying and what they think is the most effective way to do that. And we encourage that kind of participation from students to come up with plans that will work in individual school settings.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Melissa. I know there are a couple of questions we didn't quite get to, but I appreciate everyone writing in. I also appreciate your patience when I lost my microphone there for a second. But Jennifer and Melissa, we were so grateful for you taking this time to share your research with us. And thank you to all of you for participating today. I hope you'll join us for other webinars. We have one next month with BU Economics Professor Lawrence Kotlikoff. He's going to talk about how to get the most out of your Social Security. If you'd like to register, please go to bu.edu/alumni/events. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to all of you who joined the conversation today. We appreciated all of your questions.